Turn with me, please, to the book of Job. The book of Job, and starting in chapter 30. The book of Job, chapter 30, and beginning at verse 20. So Job 30 and verse 20. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. And this is Job speaking. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death, and to the house appointed for all living. Howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Did I not weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? When I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of my affliction prevented me. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and cried in the congregation. I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. My heart also is turned to mourning, and my organ into the voice of them that weep. Chapter 31. I made a covenant with mine eyes why then should I think upon a maid? For what portion of God is there from above, and what inheritance from the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked, and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doth not he see my ways, and count all my steps? If I have walked in vanity, or my foot hath hasted to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know my integrity. Verse 35. Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me. Let's jump to chapter 38. The book of Job, in chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is he that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and thou wilt answer me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. And then in Job 40, and beginning at verse 1. Job 40 and verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he contend with the Almighty? Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. And Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. I have spoken once I have spoken, but I will not answer, yea, twice I will proceed no further. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up now thy loins like a man. I will demand of thee, and thou wilt answer me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God, or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold every one that is proud and abase him. Look on every one that is proud and break him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. Then will I also confess unto thee, that thine own right hand can save thee. Behold now Behemoth, which I have made with thee, he eateth grass like an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar, and the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong as pieces of brass, his bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring forth food, where the beasts of the fields play. He lieth under the shady trees, and in the covert of the reed and ferns. The shade of the trees cover him with their shadow, and the willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinketh up a river, and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes, his nose pierceth through snares. Chapter 41. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with the cord which thou layest down? Canst thou put a hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with thorn? Will he make many supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for a servant forever? So far. So the book of Job. is a very unique book that we have in Scripture. Much of it is composed of a discussion that takes place between Job and his friends. And really, it's a book about suffering. It's a book about trials and really why they happen. That's really what the whole discussion is about. For about 30 or so chapters, Job and his friends are discussing suffering and why it happens. But it's often, too, it's a very challenging book as well. I think generally speaking, because of the way that everything is constructed and the way that the discussion goes, and even God's answer, which we'll look at today, I think it can be very challenging to begin to understand. But even just the words that are spoken can be a bit challenging. And it seems, I think a lot of times too, it's an easy book that we sometimes like to skip over a little bit or read through quickly. But I think the book of Job has a lot of really, really important lessons for us about suffering. But even further than that, we can see a lot of the ways of God. We can see a lot too, even how we should treat others when they are going through sufferings and difficulties. We see a lot of pretty much the opposite too of how we probably shouldn't treat others when they are going through suffering and how they are going through difficulties from Job's friends. But today I really want to focus on more of the words of Job and the words of God. But before we kind of jump into the words that Job spoke and the answer that God gives him, just want to make sure we're familiar with the kind of general view of Job. The book of Job begins, and we're not given too much background on Job. We're told very little of when this story actually takes place. Job is mentioned to be from the land of Uz, and that's really generally the background that we are given. We know that he is wealthy. We know that God has blessed him with a lot of different things. We know that he has children and sons and daughters and all these different things, but we don't know when this book takes place. Many people speculate that it probably took place around the time of Abraham. Some people think a little bit later. There's different reasons for that throughout the book if you read it, and you can make your own guesses. But we're not told any of that. But in the first two chapters, I think it's the chapters that we're probably most familiar with. And we get a very unique view into God's dealings with Satan and with the different sons of God. Starting out in the book, we're given this heavenly view of God and Satan approaching him, and really God bringing up Job. God brings up Job. He talks about how he is serving him, how he's a servant of God, but he also talks about the good qualities of Job as well. And it's very interesting because God is the one who really, if you want to say, starts it. He brings up Job to Satan. And Satan accuses Job of simply following after God because God has given him blessings. So he's simply doing good, and he's really challenging Job's genuineness, or Job's heart, really. So the Lord allows for Satan to attack Job in some way. He says that he can take away the blessings that he has given him, but he's not allowed to touch his body at all. Satan goes to as far extreme as he possibly could. He wipes out Job's entire family, wipes out all of Job's possessions in seemingly just a day. Job, though, in faith, doesn't sin with his lips, it says. And we have a beautiful verse, too, where he talks about how the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. In the second chapter, we have a similar story. We have the Lord again bringing up Job to Satan. Satan again challenges the Lord, saying that Job is not genuine in his faith, that he still has his body and his health, so that's why he has not cursed God, and that's why he has not given up, essentially, on God. So the Lord again allows Satan to touch Job's body, but to not take his life. Job then suffers not only the loss of all the possessions that he had, his family, but now his body also is suffering too. He has boils. It seems that he is in an absolutely miserable state. But at the end of this chapter, this is where we have Job's friends come to meet him. And Job's 3 friends come, and they sit with him for 7 days and don't say anything. And it's very easy, I think, to go and look at all the different things that Job's friends did wrong. And I think there are a lot of things that they said that were wrong. I think the way that they treat Job as the book progresses is not the best either. But I do want to make one quick side note before, again, we get to the words of Job and the words of the Lord, that Job's friends, for as many things as we could say kind of negatively against them, I do think that they do show at least some characteristics of the kind of friendships that we should have as Christians and the kind of love that we should show to others. First of all, if you read the end of chapter 2, you can see that they made a point to come and see Job. In Job's sufferings, they didn't ignore him, they didn't leave him on his own, and they truly believe that Job did something wrong, as we start to see, but they still do not give up on Job. And I think that's a very beautiful characteristic. And additionally, as the book progresses and you see that they get more and more upset with Job and more kind of pushing him away, they still do not abandon him as well. Job talks later about how others maybe have abandoned him, but these three friends do at least stick with him. So I think, although they may not have been the best advice or the best comforters, they clearly at least had some kind of care for Job. But the next portion of the book, from chapters 3 to, I think it's 37, or 37, before the Lord actually answers, the majority of this book is just made up of a discussion between Job and his friends. It starts out with Job cursing the day that he was born, and then it progresses to his friends answering him and responding back. Usually it kind of goes in a cycle where Job will say something, his friends will each individually respond, Job will respond back to them, and that happens a few times. And you could read all the different arguments that they make, but they each kind of bring a different perspective on suffering. Eliphaz kind of talks about a lot of his personal experience of things that he's seen in the past. Bildad talks about things that happened in the past, so things that he's heard about and why sufferings happen. And Zophar brings a lot of logic to this discussion too, and tries to say he knows things about why sufferings happen. But they all really come to the same point. All three friends of Job decide that Job must have done some kind of horrible, horrible sin, so that's why God is punishing him. And it starts out kind of implying that almost, and it gets to the point, if you read, I think it's chapter 22, where they essentially just blatantly start to accuse Job of things. They've just decided that he has done this thing wrong or that thing wrong. And they kind of get more and more frustrated with as they interact with Job. But in chapter 32, we actually have one more friend that comes. This final friend, Elihu, we don't read of him coming with the original friends, although he might have been there, we're not 100% sure. Or maybe he came a little bit later or something like that, but Elihu brings a little bit of a different perspective. Many people think that he was probably the closest to being correct about Job's sufferings. Even in the last chapter, when the Lord rebukes the three friends of Job, he does not mention Elihu, so many think that because he didn't rebuke him specifically, that maybe his words were a little bit better. Many people think he's a little bit long-winded as well. He talks for 5 or so chapters, and some people think that he doesn't say that much, but I think Elihu, from a general perspective, also points out that Job may have sinned. That could be a reason for his suffering. He points out that Job might have sinned, might simply be suffering because something that is wrong in his life or something that he is going to do. So he's kind of making predictions about why. But he kind of comes to the final point of viewing God, I think, in an incorrect way. Elihu views God as very, very strict. He basically says that, Job, you are suffering, and not specifically talking about the care of God or anything like that. He basically just says you have to accept it because God is God and he can do whatever he would like. And those are really the four arguments, I guess, that his friends all bring to Job. So I want to focus, though, on the portions that we read in chapter 30 and then later with God's responses. So Job, throughout the entire book, throughout all those arguments of all his friends coming to him and saying all these horrible things about him, of accusing him constantly of being some kind of horrible sinner, Job maintains his innocence. He maintains that he did not commit a particular sin. I think, and I know some may disagree, but I do think at points Job does admit that he is a sinner in general, that he is not perfect. I don't think Job ever really claims to be completely perfect, but he does maintain his kind of overall integrity. The verses that we read give, I think, a quick overview of how Job was feeling throughout this suffering. And I think they're really important verses because you can read all the different words of Job, and they are a beautiful representation, I think, of suffering and what we oftentimes go through when we are suffering. But for Job himself, he went through really unbelievable suffering. If again, just pointing back to the beginning, Job lost his entire family in a day. His wife is still alive, but all his children are wiped out in a day. And apart from that, he loses everything that he owns, again, in a single day. And it's, if you read the chapter, how it plays out is back to back to back. And then not only do all those things get wiped out from him, but now he is suffering, I think, beyond what we can imagine. He had some kind of horrible, horrible disease and just uncomfortness. But I think throughout the whole thing, the hardest thing for Job, as you read the different verses and the different chapters where Job talks about all of his suffering, I think the hardest thing for Job was that he felt that God had abandoned him. He felt that God was no longer with him. Really, if you read the earlier chapters, there is a chapter, I think 1 or 2 before this, in 28 or 29, where Job talks about how his life was before. And it's not really even just about the wealth that he had or anything like that. It's really talking about how he felt that he was close with God before. And as we get to the chapter 30, these verses here, he starts out by saying that he's crying out to God and God is not hearing him. And I think that's a feeling that we all, at times in our life, can feel as well. When we go through a challenge or we go through a difficulty, we can really try to be praying to God, but a lot of times when these sufferings happen or when difficulties happen, we feel that there is truly no answer, and we feel that maybe God has abandoned us. And Job, again, I think, is a very, very extreme example, but no matter what suffering or difficulty we face, we can all feel this way, that God is not with us, that God is not close to us, that no matter what we do, God will not answer us. And as I said, in chapter 31, Job goes through kind of a whole different aspect of it as well. Not only does he feel that God will not answer him, but his friends' accusations, he claims, are completely incorrect. In chapter 31, although it may sound a bit prideful, I think, of what Job says in chapter 31, but I think everything that he's highlighting there is true. I think Job was, as God even mentions it in chapters 1 and 2, that Job is upright and eschewing evil. And I think chapter 31, he highlights a lot of those things that he did. He followed God, and he feels that because he's following after God, that there shouldn't be this suffering, or that because he's following after God, if there is this suffering, he should have an answer for it. All his friends disagree, and all his friends don't really help him out in this way, but Job feels abandoned by God, again, a way that we often can feel when we are going through a trial or a difficulty. But in chapter 38, after all this discussion, the last few chapters of this book are God's response to Job's suffering. And God talks about a few different things. First of all, in chapter 38, and it goes into 39 as well, the Lord talks about creation. He talks about all the intricacies. He starts, the few verses I read, we started with the foundations of the earth, but as you go down, he starts talking about the sea, and he talks about the land, and he talks about even the stars and things like that, and he gets smaller and smaller until he gets to individual animals, and he talks about the intricacies of their lives. He talks about donkeys and ostriches and other animals, and just the details and the beauty of each individual thing, but also, too, he talks about how all of those he understands, and he challenges Job to say, do you understand all of this? That Job truly cannot understand all of creation. But in chapter 40 and 41, God brings up 2 additional animals. There's the behemoth and Leviathan. And again, this is another point of the book of Job where I don't think we have an exact, clear answer on. Many think that the behemoth is a hippo, and that the Leviathan is an alligator. Some other people think they're dinosaurs or something different. But no matter what they are, God points to them and points out really their immovable strength. He talks about the behemoth and the strength that he has. He talks about the Leviathan and how it cannot be caught. He challenges Job to say, can he make a covenant with it? Can he make it a servant? And all these different things. It even says about the behemoth in verse 19 that we read, that he is the chief of the ways of God. And you may read all of that, and you may say that, and that's where just to note, in chapter 41, there is a longer description of the Leviathan, and then that's where God's response ends. And you may read all of that and feel that it's a little bit unfair. Job had been asking God, Job had been pleading to God for an answer to a reason why he was suffering. The Lord could have very easily simply repeated chapters 1 and 2 to Job. In fact, I don't know if we might assume that Job wrote the book of Job, or it might have been written by someone else. Job might have never known that chapters 1 and 2 occurred. We don't have it recorded that God told him any of that. And you may also think it's unfair because there are many other stories in the Bible where we have reasons for suffering. If you look at the story of Joseph, for example, Joseph, when his brothers come before him, he can say to them, all the things that you meant for evil, God meant them for good. He saw the purpose in all his suffering. He saw why all these bad things happened to him. He saw why he was in prison for all those years. He saw why his brothers sold him into slavery, because he eventually would be able to save them and all these different things and save really an entire nation from famine. We have in John 9 in the New Testament, if you read it, that we just recently studied here on Sunday afternoon, the man born blind. The Lord gives an exact reason why he was born blind. He says it wasn't because of sin, it's so that, I think it's so that the Son of Man may be glorified in him, maybe mixing that up. In chapter 11 of John 2, in Lazarus' death, we have the same kind of reasoning too, that God may be glorified. And we even mentioned it a couple weeks ago. When we see Lazarus raised from the dead, we also see the reason why that many were saved, because they saw the miracle of Lazarus being raised from the dead. So many times there are reasons, and specific reasons for suffering. We even have in the New Testament, there are reasons why we suffer. It may be because of punishment, it may be because the Lord is teaching us or training us, or just pointing us back to him. But the way God answers Job in these chapters is very different than I think we would expect. It's different than what Job's friends expected. Job's friends expected God to come and say, yes, Job, you sinned, you did something wrong, so that's why you're suffering. Job was hoping to have an explanation, to say, I am just, Job, so this is the reason why you are suffering. It was because of X, Y, Z. But that's not what God does. But I think God's answer is truly beautiful in what he says to Job. Although it is a little bit different, although it is different than Job might have been expecting, it still really shows God's love and God's care for Job as well. So the first thing I want to mention is that, first of all, God does answer Job. It's easy to look at this book, to read those last few chapters, to read about all the suffering and say, God doesn't really answer Job. But I think the most important thing here is that God really does answer Job. It may not be in the way that he was expecting. It may not be in the way that Job wanted. It may not be in the way that Job's friends wanted, or that we even want when we read a book like Job. But God did provide an answer. And really the answer being that Job was not alone. Job was not abandoned when all these sufferings were going on. In fact, God was with him throughout all of it. The first thing that God points to in his actual response, though, is creation. He points to the intricacies and the details and all the little things that God knew about creation, the little things and the big things that God knew and God takes care of in creation. And I think the reason he pointed to that for Job was to show Job that even in Job's intricacies and the details of his life, that God is with him. God sees all of it. Job felt abandoned. Job felt that God did not see him. And that's how we may feel in sufferings. But it's important to know that God takes care of all the creation around us, and he is looking and seeing the suffering and the difficulties that we go through as well. And the two creatures that he brings up, I think, again, it's a little bit of a tricky point of Job. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at those two creatures. I think there are ways to look at them as views of sin and views of different things like that. But I think from a very simple perspective too, these two creatures, the behemoth and the leviathan, simply represent pretty much things that are outside of the control of our lives. We oftentimes want to control everything in our lives. We want to feel that we are on top of everything. We want to make lists and check off boxes and say, I did this and I did that. But many times when sufferings come in, the reason they come in is, or when they do come in, they really show us that we cannot control these things. We cannot be in control of our own lives. There is chaos around us. There is sin around us. There are difficulties and challenges that we will always face in this life. But when God is challenging Job, he asks him questions over and over about these two animals, especially about the Leviathan. He asks him all these different questions about him, asking him if he can control it and all these different things. And the answer is that Job cannot. And the answer for us, too, is that oftentimes we can't control things in our lives. We can't control the difficulties and the challenges that we will face. But what's amazing about the answer of God is that all these things that he is saying to Job, all these things that he is challenging him with these creatures that are completely outside of his control, is that there is one who is in control of all of them, and that is the Lord himself. So, like I said, there are reasons sometimes why we suffer. There are very clear reasons given in Scripture that we have done something wrong, that the Lord is teaching us or the Lord is showing us something. And sometimes I think, by God's grace, we get to understand some of those reasons. We get to see sometimes the end of our own story, where we get to know, okay, I can see part of it at least, why God allowed for this difficulty to come in. But I think there's also times that we may suffer like Job, that we may face challenges and difficulties and truly not maybe understand the exact reason why. And in those times, I think it's really important to remember these lessons, that God is with us. That even if we feel that God is no longer with us or abandoned us in sufferings, that he is always with us. We also should always remember, too, that he cares for all the creation, all the things that are around us, and he cares for us as well, and the intricacies and the details that we don't even understand about our own lives. And also, too, in the chaos and in the difficulty and in the challenges and things that are so outside of our control, there is one who is in control of all those things, and that is the Lord himself. And in the last chapter, just to kind of close us out, Job repents. We don't see God specifically telling Job that he must repent. God tells Job's friends that they must repent. But Job repents. And I think there's a lot of different things that you could look at that Job probably repented for, probably cursing the day that he was born, probably for almost at points implying that maybe God was unjust and all these different things. And maybe this is part of the reason why God allowed this suffering, so that Job would be able to see more of God's glory and understand it more and be closer to the Lord. But the thing I want to note as well, though, is when we are going through sufferings, not only do we have a God who cares, not only do we have a God who's with us, who sees all the intricacies, who is in control of all these different things, but we have a God who cares about us and wants to hear us speak to him as well. I think it's really important that Job is not specifically rebuked here for his words. In fact, it says Job spoke rightly. I don't think all of Job's words were right in the book of Job. If you read them, he says some things that I don't think were exactly correct. But God does not rebuke him for those, because God understands that when Job was going through a difficulty and a challenge, that he needed to speak to him. He needed to speak to God. And I think when we go through sufferings and challenges, that we should always be speaking to God as well, letting him know and casting all of our care upon him. And just again, I hope it encourages us to remember that when we are going through difficulties, when we are going through sufferings, even if we feel like we don't see an escape or we don't see really the true end, that we know that God is always with us and that he is caring for us. Amen.